The crystal chandeliers of Ravenshollow Castle gleamed like frozen tears against the vaulted ceilings, their light dancing across Persian carpets that cost more than entire villages could earn in a decade. For 24-year-old Seraphina Delacroix, the ancient stone corridors reeked of privilege, wrapped in lavender sachets and her own bone-deep exhaustion. Each chime of the tower bells marked another hour of her invisible existence in a world where servants were seen but never truly observed. But when Duchess Isabelle Montclair stepped through the oak doors of her daughter's solar that rain-soaked morning in March, the sight that greeted her would unravel a web of lies that had taken 30 years to weave. Ravenshollow Castle perched on the cliffs of Northumberland like a stone guardian against the churning North Sea, its towers and battlements a testament to 8 centuries of Montclair dominance. The current Duchess, Isabelle Montclair, ruled over the vast estate with the same iron will that had built the family fortune through shipping, textiles, and strategic marriages that consolidated power across 3 kingdoms. Seraphina Delacroix had arrived at Ravenshollow 3.5 years ago, fleeing a tragedy that had shattered her world in the village of St. Emilion. Her mother's death from consumption had left her not only orphaned but discovered to be illegitimate, stripping her of any claim to her mother's modest inheritance. The village priest, Father Benedict, had written to his cousin, the castle's chaplain, asking if there might be work for a girl of good character who found herself with nowhere to go. Mrs. Blackthorne, the head housekeeper, had taken one look at Seraphina's refined manners and educated speech and assigned her to the upper floors. "You've got the bearing of quality," the stern woman had said, "even if fate hasn't been kind to your circumstances." Seraphina's primary responsibility was caring for 12-year-old Lady Evangeline Montclair, the Duchess's only child and heir to the vast Montclair holdings. The girl had been a lonely figure when Seraphina first arrived. Her father had died in a hunting accident when she was 7, and her mother, consumed by grief and the demands of managing the estate, had little time for motherly affections. But Seraphina saw through Evangeline's rebellious facade to the hurt, scared child underneath. She began approaching her charge differently, not as a problem to be managed, but as a young person hungry for connection and understanding. "Why do you run away from your lessons?" Seraphina had asked during their first week together. "Because Latin is stupid, and I'll never use it," Evangeline had replied sulkily. "Mother says I'll marry some duke or earl and have babies and run his household. What do I need to know about Caesar's conquests for?" Perhaps Seraphina had said, settling beside her, "But what if you want to read the medical texts in the castle library, or understand the legal documents that govern your lands? Knowledge is power, little dove, and power should never be given away lightly." From that moment their relationship transformed from one of reluctant duty to genuine affection. Seraphina discovered that Evangeline was gifted with languages, fascinated by botany, and had inherited her grandmother's gift for herbalism and healing. The secret garden was Seraphina's discovery, found during her second month at the castle while exploring the grounds. Tucked behind the old chapel ruins and hidden by a copse of ancient yew trees, it was a small enclosed space that had clearly once been carefully maintained, but had been abandoned for decades. Wild roses climbed over crumbling stone walls, their thorny canes intertwined with jasmine and honeysuckle. Herb beds had run riot, creating a fragrant tangle of rosemary, lavender, thyme and chamomile. In the center stood a weathered stone fountain, long dry but still beautiful, carved with symbols that seemed to predate even the castle's oldest sections. Most intriguingly, despite its abandoned state, the garden continued to flourish with varieties of flowers and herbs that shouldn't have survived without careful tending. Exotic orchids bloomed alongside English roses, Mediterranean lavender thrived next to Scottish heather, and delicate French lilies of the valley carpeted the spaces between more common wildflowers. Seraphina had begun secretly maintaining the garden, visiting in the early morning hours before her duties began. The work soothed something in her soul that had been raw since her mother's death. It was her grandmother's garden knowledge that guided her efforts. Grandmère Céleste had been the village herbalist in Saint-Emilion, a woman whose remedies were sought by peasant and nobleman alike. She had taught Seraphina not just which plants had healing properties, but the old ways of cultivation, how to encourage plants to grow in harmony, how to create gardens that seem to tend themselves through careful balance and ancient wisdom. Plants have memories, Grandmère Céleste used to say. They remember the hands that loved them, the songs that were sung to them, the tears that watered them. A garden loved properly will care for itself long after the gardener is gone. This particular morning, Seraphina had gathered an armful of the garden's finest offerings, pale pink roses still heavy with dew, sprigs of lavender, delicate forget-me-nots, and branches of flowering hawthorn. "Would you like me to show you how to make a flower crown?" she had asked Evangeline. "It's an old tradition from my grandmother's village." Evangeline's eyes had lit up with interest, like the queens in the old stories. Exactly like that little dove, every flower has its own meaning, its own power. When you weave them together properly, you create something magical. As Evangeline settled into the window seat, raindrops racing down the glass behind her, Seraphina began her work. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, selecting each bloom with care, and weaving them into the girl's auburn curls with an intricate braiding technique that seemed to come from instinct rather than conscious memory. "The roses are for love," Seraphina explained, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence her grandmother had used. "Not just romantic love, but the deep abiding love between family members, between friends, between those who truly see each other's souls." She wove in sprigs of lavender next, lavender for devotion and protection. It watches over those we care about even when we cannot be with them. The forget-me-nots came next, their tiny blue faces like fragments of captured sky. These are for remembrance. They help us hold on to the love of those who came before us, who live on in our memories and in our hearts. As she worked, Seraphina found herself humming, a melody that seemed to rise from some deep place in her memory, notes that her throat knew, even though her mind couldn't place their origin. It was a haunting tune, neither fully sad nor completely happy, but something more complex, a song of longing, of loss of love, that transcended time and circumstances. "That song," Evangeline whispered. "It's so beautiful. Where did you learn it?" "From my grandmère," Seraphina replied automatically, though as the words left her lips, she realized she wasn't entirely certain that was true. The melody felt older than her grandmother's teachings, as if it had been carried in her blood, rather than taught to her ears. She added branches of flowering hawthorn to the crown, their white blossoms like tiny stars. Hawthorn for hope. It blooms in the darkest months to remind us that spring always returns, that beauty can emerge from even the harshest winters. Finally she wove in tendrils of ivy, ivy for fidelity and eternal bonds. Some connections are so strong they cannot be broken by time or distance, or even death itself. The completed crown was a masterpiece of natural artistry, transforming Evangeline from a merely pretty girl into something ethereal, otherworldly. The flowers seemed to glow against her auburn hair, and the intricate braiding technique created patterns that drew the eye ever deeper into their complexity. "It's perfect," Evangeline breathed. "I look like a fairy queen." "You look like what you are," Seraphina said softly, "a young woman of noble blood with ancient power in her veins." The words had slipped out without conscious thought, and both of them stared at each other in surprise. Before either could comment on the strange moment, the Solar's heavy oak door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the stone chamber like a death knell. Duchess Isabelle Montclair stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, her black mourning dress stark against the grey stone walls, her silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the aristocratic bones of her face. At 47, she retained the commanding beauty that had made her the toast of 3 royal courts in her youth, though grief and responsibility had carved sharp lines around her ice-blue eyes. She had returned early from her morning ride, driven back by the worsening weather and a desire to check on Evangeline before the girl's music lesson. What she had expected to find was her daughter at her desk, practicing penmanship or reviewing her French vocabulary. What she saw instead was a tableau that seemed to stop time itself. Her daughter sat in the window seat, like a vision from a medieval romance, crowned with flowers woven into her hair, with such artistry that it seemed the work of fairy hands rather than mortal skill. And standing behind Evangeline, her servant's hand still tangled in the girl's auburn curls, was the French maid whose presence had always made the Duchess vaguely uncomfortable in ways she had never been able to articulate. But it wasn't the sight of the flower crown that stopped the Duchess's breath in her throat. It was the melody that hung in the air like incense, the wordless tune that the maid had been humming as she worked. The Duchess knew that song. She had known it 31 years ago when she was 16, and still Lady Isabel Fairfax, before her marriage to the Duke, before her daughter's birth, before the weight of responsibility had taught her to bury the reckless passions of youth. She had known it in the secret garden behind the chapel ruins, where she had met in clandestine embrace with someone she should never have loved, someone whose memory she had spent 3 decades trying to forget. The melody was Chanson de la Rose Eternelle, the song of the eternal rose, an ancient French ballad that spoke of forbidden love, of bonds that transcended social barriers, of passion that could not be killed by time or duty, or the demands of honor. It was the song her lover had sung to her in those stolen moments, when the rest of the world fell away, and only they existed, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the climbing roses that still grew wild in the abandoned garden. She had never taught that song to anyone, had never hummed it where another soul might hear. It was her most closely guarded secret, buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it had been a dream. So how was this servant girl humming it with perfect pitch, perfect rhythm, perfect emotional understanding of its haunting beauty? Where did you learn that song? The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they carried the weight of command that had been bred into generations of Montclair women. Both Seraphina and Evangeline froze at the sound, the maid's hand stilling in the girl's hair, her voice cutting off mid-note. Seraphina turned slowly, her face already pale with the knowledge that she had transgressed in some way she didn't understand. "Your Grace, my grandmère taught it to me. It's an old lullaby from her village." "Your grandmother?" The Duchess stepped into the room, her silk skirts rustling against the stone floor. "What was her name?" "Céleste Dubois, Your Grace. She lived in Saint-Emilion until she died 7 years ago." The name hit the Duchess like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white beneath her kid gloves, her face draining of color until she looked like a marble statue given momentary life. Céleste Dubois. Not just any village herbalist, but the woman who had served as lady's maid to her own mother, the previous Duchess, until a scandal had forced her sudden departure from Ravenshollow Castle. The woman who had been her confidante during those rebellious teenage years, who had covered for her secret meetings, who had known about the forbidden romance that had nearly destroyed everything the Montclair family held dear. The woman who had disappeared from the castle in the middle of a winter night 31 years ago, taking with her secrets that could have brought down one of the most powerful noble houses in England. And if this girl was Céleste's granddaughter, if she carried Céleste's blood and Céleste's knowledge, then she was more than just a servant who had learned an old song. She was a living reminder of the past the Duchess had fought so hard to bury. Looking at the maid again, really looking at her this time, the Duchess saw what she had been unconsciously avoiding for 3.5 years. The girl's bone structure was too refined for a peasant's daughter. Her hands were soft despite years of work, with the long elegant fingers of someone born to finer things. Her posture was naturally erect, her voice cultured despite the faint French accent. Most tellingly, her eyes were an unusual shade of violet blue that seemed to shift color in different lights. Eyes exactly like those of the man she had loved and lost 31 years ago. Eyes like her own daughter's. Eyes that could only come from one bloodline, the ancient and powerful family whose secret heir had been hidden away to protect both their lives and the Duchess's reputation. "Get out." The words came out as a strangled whisper. "Your Grace." Seraphina's confusion was evident. "Get out." The roar echoed off the stone walls like thunder. "Pack your belongings and leave this castle immediately. You are dismissed from service." "Mama." "No." Evangeline leaped to her feet, the flower crown sliding askew. "Seraphina hasn't done anything wrong." Silence. The Duchess's voice cut through her daughter's protests. "This woman is not who she claims to be. She's dangerous." Seraphina stood frozen, clutching the remaining flowers. "Your Grace, I don't understand. If I've given offense, you know exactly what you've done," the Duchess said, her voice deadly quiet now. "Playing your little games, worming your way into my daughter's affections, singing your grandmother's songs. Did you think I wouldn't recognize the tune? Did you think I wouldn't know where it came from?" "I don't know what you mean," Seraphina protested, but she could see the truth blazing in the Duchess's eyes. This wasn't about a simple song or an innocent flower crown. This was about secrets that ran deeper than servants' gossip, older than castle walls, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The dismissal was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Within 2 hours, Seraphina found herself standing in the castle's great courtyard with her few possessions packed into the same carpet bag she had arrived with 3.5 years earlier. Mrs. Blackthorne had handed her a purse containing her final wages, considerably more than she had earned, which only added to her confusion and fear. "I don't understand what happened," Seraphina said to the head housekeeper. Lady Evangeline was happy. "I've never caused trouble. Why would Her Grace react so violently to a simple flower crown?" Mrs. Blackthorne, who had served the Montclair family for over 40 years, looked around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There are things about this family's history that go deeper than servants' gossip," she said quietly. "Your grandmother, she was more than just a lady's maid here. She was involved in matters that nearly brought scandal to the house. But what does that have to do with me? I was a child when she died. I know nothing about her life before St. Emilion." The older woman studied Seraphina's face with eyes that had seen decades of secrets come and go. "Child, has anyone ever told you that you have the look of quality about you, that your mannerisms are too refined for your station?" "My grandmother raised me to be respectable," Seraphina replied defensively. "Aye, but respectability can be taught. Breeding shows in the bones, in the way you carry yourself, in the instincts you can't help but follow." Mrs. Blackthorne hesitated, then leaned closer. "Your grandmother left this castle under circumstances that were never fully explained. She disappeared in the middle of the night during the worst scandal this family had ever faced. Those who knew the truth of it took their secrets to the grave." "What scandal?" But Mrs. Blackthorne was already shaking her head. "I've said too much already. The Duchess has been good to me and mine for decades. I won't repay that loyalty with gossip." As Seraphina walked down the long drive away from the castle, her mind churned with questions and half-formed fears. At the gate she paused to look back at Ravenshollow Castle, its towers disappearing into low-hanging clouds. In one of the highest windows she could see a small figure pressed against the glass, Evangeline still wearing the flower crown, watching her leave with tears streaming down her face. The sight nearly broke Seraphina's resolve. For 3.5 years this place had been her home, that lonely girl her greatest joy. Now she was being cast out like a criminal, with no explanation beyond cryptic references to her grandmother's secrets. But as she turned away from the castle and began the long walk toward the village, a new determination began to replace her grief and confusion. If there were secrets about her grandmother's past, about her own identity, about the connection between the Dubois and Montclair families, then she would uncover them. The Duchess's violent reaction had revealed more than she probably intended. That melody meant something specific, something dangerous enough to destroy a servant's life to protect. And if Seraphina was who Mrs. Blackthorne seemed to think she might be, then perhaps she had more power to seek answers than anyone realized. The village of Thornwick sat in a valley below the castle like a collection of toy houses, its thatched roofs and stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Seraphina made her way to the Shepherd's Rest, the village's only inn, where she secured a small room under the eaves. That evening, as she sat in the inn's common room, she became aware of the conversation at the next table. Two elderly men were discussing the day's excitement. "Castle maid got herself dismissed today," one was saying. "Young French girl who's been there 3-4 years, packed up and sent packing without ceremony." "The French one," his companion replied with interest. "Wonder what she did to earn the Duchess's displeasure." "Could be anything with that family," the first man said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "They've got secrets buried deeper than the old Celtic graves. Remember the scandal when we were lads? The business with the previous duke's brother and that maid who disappeared." Seraphina's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. She strained to hear more, but the men had begun speaking in voices too low to catch clearly. The previous duke's brother, a maid who disappeared, a scandal that had happened decades ago but was still remembered by the village elders. Could this be connected to her grandmother's departure from the castle? The timeline would fit. Her grandmother had died 7 years ago, and according to Mrs. Blackthorne, she had left Ravenshollow around 30 years past. Over the next few days, Seraphina made herself useful around the village, offering to help with tasks that would put her in contact with the older residents who might remember the events of 3 decades past. She mended clothes for the seamstress, helped the baker's wife, and assisted the vicar in organizing the church's collection of old parish records. It was during this last task that she made her first real breakthrough. Father Aldrich was a scholarly man in his 70s who had served as Thornwick's vicar for over 50 years. As Seraphina helped him organize baptismal certificates and marriage records, she casually mentioned her interest in local history. "I've always been fascinated by the great families," she said. "The Montclairs must have some interesting tales in their family history." Father Aldrich glanced up from the ledger he was examining. "Indeed they do, child, though not all of them are pleasant ones. The family has faced its share of trials over the centuries. Mrs. Blackthorne mentioned something about a scandal years ago involving the Duke's brother. It must have been quite serious to still be remembered." The vicar's expression grew troubled. "Ah, that would be Lord Edmund Montclair, the late Duke's younger brother, a brilliant man, a scholar and poet, but pride and passion make for dangerous companions, especially when combined with noble blood. What happened to him?" Father Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally he seemed to reach a decision. "Lord Edmund fell in love with someone entirely inappropriate, a servant girl, a French maid who worked as lady's companion to the Duchess. The affair went on for nearly 2 years before it was discovered." Seraphina's hands trembled. "And then?" "The Duke was furious, of course. The family's reputation was at stake, and there were political ramifications. Lord Edmund was being considered for a diplomatic position. The maid was dismissed immediately and disappeared from the area. And Lord Edmund, he was shipped off to the family's holdings in India. He died of fever within 6 months of his arrival. Some say it was the climate that killed him, but others say he died of a broken heart." The room seemed to spin around Seraphina. Her grandmother, Céleste Dubois, had been a lady's companion to the previous Duchess. She had been involved in a love affair with Lord Edmund Montclair that had resulted in scandal and exile for both of them. "Father," she said carefully, "did this maid, was there ever any suggestion that the relationship had produced consequences?" The old priest gave her a sharp look. "Why do you ask, child? I'm trying to understand my own family's history. My grandmother never spoke of her past, and there are gaps in what I know about her life." Father Aldrich studied her face intently, and she could see recognition dawning in his eyes. "Your grandmother was Céleste Dubois." "Yes, dear God," he breathed. "I wondered when I first saw you in the village, why you looked so familiar. You have his eyes, child, Lord Edmund's eyes, and his hands. See how long your fingers are, how elegant your gestures. That's noble breeding." The confirmation hit her like a physical blow. Everything she had believed about her identity, her family, her place in the world crumbled in an instant. "Are you saying that Lord Edmund was your grandfather?" Father Aldrich said gently. "Which makes you the granddaughter of a Duke of Montclair, child. No wonder the current Duchess sent you away. You're a walking reminder of the family's greatest scandal." That night Seraphina lay awake in her small room, trying to process everything she had learned. She was the granddaughter of a duke. Her blood carried centuries of noble lineage. Under different circumstances, she might have been raised in luxury, educated by the finest tutors, married to advantage within the highest circles of society. Instead, she had been deliberately hidden away, raised in ignorance and poverty, condemned to a life of servitude to protect the very family that had cast out her grandmother and grandfather. But if she truly was Lord Edmund's granddaughter, then there had to be proof somewhere.
Love letters perhaps, or legal documents, or witnesses who remembered the truth of what had happened 30 years ago. Her grandmother had kept some secrets, but she couldn't have destroyed all evidence of the affair that had defined the rest of her life. The next morning Seraphina made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. Instead of seeking new employment, or planning to return to France, she would stay in Thornwick and uncover the full truth of her heritage.
Getting back onto the castle grounds without permission was dangerous, but Seraphina's knowledge of the servants' routines and the estate's hidden paths made it possible. She chose a moonless night, when heavy clouds provided additional cover, slipping through gaps in the estate wall. The abandoned garden looked different in the darkness, wilder, more mysterious, touched with an otherworldly quality that seemed to whisper of ancient secrets. Seraphina made her way carefully to the central fountain, using her hands more than her eyes to navigate the familiar paths. The fountain itself had always intrigued her. The stonework was clearly much older than the rest of the castle, carved with symbols that seemed to predate Christian influences. Now running her fingers over the weathered surfaces by moonlight, she felt a loose stone near the base. Working carefully, she managed to pry the stone free, revealing a small hollow space behind it. Her heart pounded as she reached inside and felt the oilcloth-wrapped bundle that had been hidden there for 30 years. Inside the wrapping were items that made her breath catch, a miniature portrait of a handsome young man with violet blue eyes and aristocratic features that she now recognized as her own. A lock of golden hair tied with blue ribbon, several love letters written in an elegant masculine hand, and a legal document that made her knees weak. The document was a private marriage certificate, signed by Father Aldrich's predecessor, and witnessed by two names she didn't recognize. It declared that Lord Edmund Montclair and Céleste Dubois had been joined in holy matrimony in a secret ceremony conducted in the chapel at Ravenshollow Castle. Her grandmother hadn't been Lord Edmund's mistress, she had been his wife, which meant Seraphina wasn't just the illegitimate granddaughter of a duke, she was the legitimate heir of a legal marriage that had been concealed to protect both families from scandal. As she clutched the marriage certificate in her trembling hands, Seraphina realized that everything had changed again. She wasn't just someone with a potential claim to noble recognition, she was someone whose very existence challenged the legal foundation of the current succession. But possessing proof and being able to use it safely were two very different things. The marriage certificate was evidence that could destroy lives, including her own. The current Duke's family would never accept her claim quietly, and they had resources to fight that she could barely imagine. Still, as she carefully rewrapped the precious documents, Seraphina felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She finally knew who she was, where she came from, and why her presence at the castle had triggered such fear. Now she had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Shepherd's Rest, a lady in an elegant traveling dress, with silver hair and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Miss Delacroix," she said, "I am Lady Catherine Fairfax. I believe we have a great deal to discuss about your family history and current circumstances. I was Lady Catherine Montclair before my marriage, Lord Edmund's younger sister." The revelation hit Seraphina like a physical blow. She was looking into the face of her great-aunt, a woman who had known both her grandparents during their secret marriage. "I've been waiting 30 years for someone from Céleste's family to return to England so that I could finally set some wrongs to right," Lady Catherine continued. I know that you've recently been dismissed from service under circumstances that probably made little sense to you. I also suspect that you've begun to uncover some truths about your family's connection to mine. Seraphina studied the older woman's face, trying to assess whether this was someone she could trust with the explosive secrets she had uncovered. Something in Lady Catherine's expression, a combination of sadness, determination, and genuine concern, decided her. I know that my grandmother was secretly married to Lord Edmund, she said quietly. I have proof of the marriage and of his acknowledgement of their child. Lady Catherine's eyebrows rose. You have proof, the marriage certificate. Among other things, yes. After all these years you actually found it. Lady Catherine was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at Seraphina. Child, do you understand what possessing that certificate means? It makes you considerably more than inconvenient for the current Duchess. It makes you the legitimate heir to a portion of the Montclair estate that was never properly settled after Edmund's death. The weight of this revelation was staggering. Seraphina had spent her entire life believing she was nobody special, an orphaned peasant girl lucky to find work in service. Now she was learning that she carried blood that could challenge one of the most powerful families in England. What am I supposed to do with this information? She asked helplessly. Lady Catherine leaned forward intently. That's exactly the conversation I hoped we would have. Because you have choices, my dear, but they all come with consequences that will affect not just you, but many other people as well. Lady Catherine Fairfax settled into the inn's private parlour, her grey eyes fixed on Seraphina with an intensity that seemed to peer into her very soul. The older woman's presence commanded the space effortlessly. Decades of moving through the highest circles of society had given her an authority that required no announcement. Before we discuss your options, Lady Catherine began, I need you to understand exactly what you're dealing with. The current Duchess isn't just protecting old scandals, she's fighting for her daughter's survival in a world that shows no mercy to those who fall from grace. Seraphina leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What do you mean? Young Lord Frederick, the current Duke, is dying, Lady Catherine said bluntly. The physicians give him perhaps 6 months, certainly no more than a year. When he passes, the succession becomes complex. There are distant male cousins who could potentially inherit, but their claims are weak and would likely face challenges in the courts. The implications hit Seraphina like a physical blow. And my claim, your claim backed by legal proof of your legitimate descent from Edmund, wouldn't give you the title directly. Inheritance law still favors male lines, but it would entitle you to a substantial portion of the Montclair wealth, properties that were never properly distributed after Edmund's death. More crucially, it would establish a competing branch of the family tree that could influence succession disputes for generations. Lady Catherine's expression grew grave. The Duchess knows this. Every day that you remain alive and aware of your heritage is another day that her daughter's future grows more precarious. She's not just protecting the past, she's waging war for the future. Seraphina felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying she would die? I'm saying that 31 years ago, your grandfather died very conveniently in India, far from witnesses who might ask uncomfortable questions. Your grandmother disappeared into obscurity, with enough money to live comfortably as long as she never spoke of her past. These are not coincidences. The parlor fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantelpiece clock, and the distant sounds of village life beyond the windows. Seraphina stared at her hands, trying to process the enormity of what Lady Catherine was suggesting. But you came forward, she said finally. You're here now, offering to help me. Why? Lady Catherine's mask of aristocratic composure slipped slightly, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. Because I've lived with the guilt of my cowardice for 31 years. When Edmund died, when Celeste vanished, I told myself there was nothing I could do. I convinced myself that preserving my own position was more important than honoring their memory, or seeking justice for their treatment. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the castle towers visible in the distance. I've spent 3 decades watching my family build their prosperity on a foundation of lies and buried truths. I've grown wealthy and comfortable, while your grandmother lived in exile and your mother grew up in poverty, never knowing she was the rightful heir to a fortune that could have changed everything for your family. And now I'm old enough not to care about consequences, and wealthy enough in my own right to weather whatever storms may come. My children are grown and established in their own lives. I have nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by finally doing what's right. Lady Catherine turned back to face Seraphina, her eyes blazing with determination. But make no mistake, if we move forward with this, we'll be declaring war on one of the most powerful families in England. They will use every resource at their disposal to destroy us, discredit our evidence, and eliminate any threat to their position. What are you proposing? Seraphina asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the steel in Lady Catherine's voice. We expose everything, Lady Catherine said simply. The secret marriage, Edmund's acknowledgement of your grandmother's child, the family's decades of cover-ups and lies. We present irrefutable evidence to the courts, and let the legal system determine what justice looks like. And if we lose, we'll likely lose everything. You'll be branded a fraud and a fortune hunter. I'll be cast out from my family, and probably face legal consequences for supporting what they'll claim is an elaborate deception. We could end up in prison or exile. Lady Catherine returned to her chair, leaning forward with intense focus. But if we win, we don't just secure your rightful inheritance. We send a message that powerful families cannot simply erase inconvenient truths by intimidation and murder. The word hung in the air like a sword blade. Murder. Lady Catherine wasn't just talking about inheritance disputes. She was talking about bringing killers to justice. You really believe they murdered my grandfather? I believe Edmund was a healthy 28-year-old man who died of a sudden fever within months of being exiled to India, despite having access to the best medical care the family could provide. I believe it's remarkably convenient that his death eliminated the most significant threat to the family's reputation and succession plans. Lady Catherine pulled a leather portfolio from her traveling bag. I've spent the last 5 years quietly investigating what really happened in India. I have correspondence between family agents, medical records that don't quite add up, and testimony from servants who were present during Edmund's final days. She spread several documents across the table. The official story is that he contracted a tropical fever and died despite the best efforts of his physicians. But the ship's doctor who treated him during his final weeks wrote confidential letters to a colleague in England, letters that describe symptoms more consistent with poisoning than any natural disease. Seraphina stared at the yellowed papers, her heart pounding. How did you obtain these? Money and persistence can uncover almost any secret given enough time. The ship's doctor's correspondence was preserved in the medical college archive. The family agent's reports were kept in the solicitor's files in London. Individual pieces of evidence that mean nothing alone, but together paint a picture of deliberate murder disguised as natural death. And you're willing to risk everything to bring this to light? Lady Catherine smiled grimly. My dear, I've already risked everything. The moment I decided to contact you, I became a threat to the same people who eliminated your grandfather. We're already in danger.
The only question is whether we'll go down fighting or allow them to silence us as they silenced him.
Over the next hour, Lady Catherine laid out a comprehensive battle plan that revealed the scope of her preparation and determination. She had been quietly building a case for years, gathering evidence, cultivating allies, and positioning herself for the moment when someone from Celeste's line would emerge to claim their rightful inheritance. The key is simultaneity, she explained, sketching out a timeline on a piece of paper. We need to file legal claims in London, present evidence to the newspapers, and seek protection from allies in Parliament all at the same moment. If we move piecemeal, they'll have time to mount counterattacks and discredit us before our case gains momentum. Who are these allies you mentioned? Members of Parliament who have their own grievances against the Montclair family's political influence. Journalists who've been investigating noble family corruption for years. Legal scholars who specialize in inheritance disputes and would relish the chance to argue such a high-profile case. Lady Catherine pulled out another document, a list of names with detailed notes beside each one. I've been cultivating these relationships carefully. None of them know the full scope of what we're planning, but each has agreed to support legitimate claims against powerful families who abuse their positions. Seraphina studied the list, recognizing several names from newspaper headlines and political scandals. These people, they're willing to risk their own careers. They're willing to risk their careers for the chance to strike a blow against a system that's protected wealth and privilege at the expense of justice for centuries. Your case isn't just about your inheritance. It's about whether powerful families can continue to literally get away with murder as long as they control enough wealth and influence. The scope of Lady Catherine's vision was breathtaking and terrifying. This wasn't just about Seraphina reclaiming her birthright. It was about challenging the entire structure of aristocratic privilege and impunity. But what about Evangeline? Seraphina asked, her heart clenching at the thought of the girl she had come to love. She's innocent in all this. If we destroy her mother's reputation and strip away her inheritance, what happens to her? Lady Catherine's expression softened slightly. That's the question that's kept me awake at night for months. The child is genuinely innocent, and she clearly loves you despite her mother's efforts to poison her against you. Then how can we justify destroying her life? Because Lady Catherine said quietly, sometimes protecting one innocent person requires exposing the crimes that have been committed in their name. Evangeline's inheritance is built on your grandfather's murder and your grandmother's exile. The luxury she's grown up with was bought with your family's blood. She leaned forward, her voice growing more intense. More importantly, if we don't act now, if we allow the current system to continue, how many more innocent people will suffer? How many more inconvenient heirs will die mysterious deaths? How many more families will be destroyed to protect the wealth and reputation of the powerful? Seraphina closed her eyes, trying to weigh justice against compassion, truth against kindness. Every choice seemed to require sacrificing something precious. There's another consideration, Lady Catherine added. If young Lord Frederick dies without heir, and if the succession dispute becomes public without your legitimate claim being established, the family's wealth could end up in the hands of distant cousins who have even less moral foundation than the current Duchess. At least you would use your inheritance to help others, to right wrongs, to create something positive from this tragedy. I need to see her, Seraphina said suddenly. Before we move forward with anything, I need to see Evangeline one more time. I need to know that she's safe, that she understands. I can't make this decision without knowing how it will affect her. Lady Catherine frowned. That's extremely dangerous. The Duchess has undoubtedly increased security around the castle, and she's probably told Evangeline that you're dangerous and not to be trusted. If you're caught on the grounds, then help me not get caught, Seraphina said firmly. You know the castle as well as I do. You grew up there. There must be ways to get inside without being detected. There are, Lady Catherine admitted reluctantly, but if something goes wrong, if you're discovered, it will destroy our entire case before we can present it. They'll claim you were attempting burglary or kidnapping, and no court in England will listen to inheritance claims from someone branded as a criminal. Then we'll have to make sure nothing goes wrong. Lady Catherine studied Seraphina's face, seeing the same stubborn determination that had driven Edmund to marry a servant against his family's wishes, the same fierce loyalty that had led Celeste to keep her secrets for 30 years rather than expose her daughter to scandal. Very well, she said finally, but we do this my way, with proper planning and preparation, and if I say abort, we abort immediately, no matter what you might see or hear. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning a reconnaissance mission that would have impressed military strategists. Lady Catherine's knowledge of the castle's layout, combined with Seraphina's intimate familiarity with the servants' routines and the building's hidden passages, created a detailed map of approach routes and contingency plans. The chapel ruins, Lady Catherine suggested. There's a passage that connects the old crypts to the castle's wine cellars. It's been blocked for decades, but I know where the key is hidden. We can get inside through the lower levels and make our way to the residential wings without being seen. What about guards? The Duchess has increased patrols, but they're focused on the main entrances and the grounds around the gardens where you were caught last time. They won't expect anyone to approach through the crypts. Most people don't even remember those passages exist. As evening approached, they finalized their plan. They would enter the castle after midnight, when most of the household would be asleep. Seraphina would make her way to Evangeline's chambers while Lady Catherine kept watch from the passage entrances. They would have 30 minutes maximum before the night patrols made their rounds. The crypts beneath the old chapel were exactly as Lady Catherine remembered them, cold, damp and filled with the musty smell of centuries-old stone and forgotten prayers. Their single candle cast dancing shadows on the carved effigies of long-dead Montclair ancestors, creating an otherworldly procession of stone faces that seemed to watch their passage with disapproval. Here, Lady Catherine whispered, stopping before a section of wall that looked identical to everything else around it. She pressed a sequence of stones, and a narrow panel swung inward with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The passage beyond was barely wide enough for one person, carved directly through the living rock that formed the castle's foundation. They crawled for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, following a route that connected the holy ground of the chapel to the secular power of the great house. When they finally emerged into the wine cellar, both women were covered in dust and cobwebs, their clothes torn by rough stone edges, but they were inside Ravenshollow Castle, undetected and unguarded. 28 minutes, Lady Catherine whispered, checking her pocket watch. The guards change at 1/2 the hour. Seraphina nodded and slipped away into the familiar corridors, her feet finding the paths she had walked thousands of times during her years of service. The castle felt different at night, larger, more mysterious, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and move independently of the moonlight streaming through tall windows. Evangeline's chambers were in the east wing, 3 floors above the wine cellar. Seraphina climbed the servants' staircases and moved through secondary corridors, avoiding the main halls where guards might be stationed. Her heart pounded with each step, but her body moved with the automatic precision of someone who had navigated these passages in the dark many times before. The door to Evangeline's solar was slightly ajar, unusual for nighttime, when the girls' chambers were normally secured. Seraphina approached cautiously, listening for sounds of movement or conversation. What she heard made her blood turn to ice. "I don't care what she told you," a man's voice was saying, rough, unfamiliar, definitely not a member of the household staff. "The girl asks too many questions. Her Grace wants the situation resolved permanently. She's just a child," another voice protested. Mrs. Blackthorne, the head housekeeper, her voice thick with distress. "Surely there must be another way." "There's no other way," the first voice replied coldly. "The French girl has allies, now dangerous ones. As long as the child remains alive and asking questions, she's a liability that threatens everything the family has built." Seraphina pressed herself against the wall, her mind reeling. They were talking about killing Evangeline, not because she was guilty of anything, but because her questions about Seraphina's dismissal made her inconvenient. "The sleeping draught is already in her evening tea," the man continued. "She won't wake up. It will look like a fever, tragic but natural for a delicate child. The physician is already prepared to sign the death certificate." "God forgive us," Mrs. Blackthorne whispered. "God has nothing to do with this," the man replied. "This is about survival. The Montclair family has protected its interests for 8 centuries. One more death to preserve that legacy is a small price to pay." Seraphina didn't think. She simply acted. Bursting through the door, she saw Mrs. Blackthorne standing beside Evangeline's bed, tears streaming down her face, while a large man in dark clothes loomed over the girl's still form. "Get away from her," Seraphina shouted. The man spun toward her, his hand moving to something beneath his coat. But Seraphina was already moving, driven by desperation and fury. She grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the mantelpiece and swung it with all her strength. The blow caught him across the temple, and he crumpled to the floor without a sound. "Seraphina," Mrs. Blackthorne gasped. "What are you doing here? How did you get inside? Is she alive?" Seraphina demanded, rushing to Evangeline's bedside. The girl was unconscious but breathing, her face pale and peaceful in the candlelight. "The sleeping draught," Mrs. Blackthorne said, her voice breaking. "They forced me to give it to her. They said it would be painless." Seraphina felt for Evangeline's pulse, weak but steady. "How long ago?" 10 minutes, perhaps 15. "I kept delaying, hoping, praying that someone would intervene." "We need to get her out of here," Seraphina said, gathering the unconscious girl in her arms. "This man won't stay unconscious forever, and there may be others." As if summoned by her words, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, heavy, purposeful, approaching fast. Lady Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face grim. "The guards are coming," she whispered urgently. "Someone must have heard the commotion. We need to leave now." "I can't carry her through the passages," Seraphina said desperately. "She's too heavy, and the space is too narrow." "Then we go out the front," Lady Catherine decided, boldly, "as if we have every right to be here." She turned to Mrs. Blackthorne. "The back stairs to the courtyard, are they clear?" "At this hour, yes, but then that's our route." Lady Catherine took Evangeline from Seraphina's arms, her years of noble training allowing her to carry the girl with surprising strength and grace. "We walk calmly, as if we're taking her to the physician for treatment of a sudden illness." It was an insane plan, but it was their only option. The 3 women made their way through the castle's corridors, Lady Catherine leading with Evangeline in her arms,
Seraphina and Mrs. Blackthorne flanking them. Anyone who saw them would see what appeared to be a family emergency, a sick child being rushed to medical attention by her relatives and a trusted servant. They encountered two guards on their way to the courtyard, but Lady Catherine's imperious manner and aristocratic bearing turned potential challenges into deferential assistance. Noble families didn't explain their actions to servants. They expected immediate compliance and support. Only when they reached the stables did Lady Catherine reveal their true destination.
"We're taking her to London," she told the startled grooms. "Prepare the fastest carriage and the strongest horses. Lady Evangeline requires specialist medical attention that cannot wait for morning." "Should we inform Her Grace?" one of the grooms asked. "Her Grace is indisposed," Lady Catherine replied coolly. "I am acting on the family's behalf. See that we are not delayed." The carriage ride to London took 8 hours through the night, with Lady Catherine's coachman pushing the horses to their limits. Evangeline remained unconscious for the first 4 hours, her breathing shallow but regular. When she finally began to stir, it was to find herself wrapped in warm blankets with Seraphina holding her hand. "Seraphina," she whispered, her voice confused and weak. "Where are we? What happened?" "You're safe now, little dove," Seraphina said gently. Your mother made some choices that put you in danger. Lady Catherine and I had to get you away from the castle. Mama tried to hurt me." Evangeline's eyes filled with tears. "Your mama was trying to protect something she thought was more important than the truth," Lady Catherine said from the opposite seat. "Sometimes good people make terrible decisions when they're afraid." Over the course of the journey, they explained everything to Evangeline, her family's hidden history, the secret marriage between Edmund and Celeste, Seraphina's true heritage, and the deadly lengths to which the current Duchess had been willing to go to protect her secrets. Evangeline listened with the solemn attention of a child forced to grow up too quickly. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring out the carriage window at the countryside rushing past. "So you're really my cousin?" she finally asked Seraphina. "I am. And my mama ordered someone to kill me, because I asked too many questions about why you were sent away." "She was frightened," Seraphina said carefully. "When people are frightened enough, they sometimes do things they never thought they were capable of." Evangeline nodded slowly, processing this explanation with a maturity that broke Seraphina's heart. "What happens now?" "Now," Lady Catherine said, "we go to London and tell the truth to people who have the power to ensure that justice is served. We expose the lies that have protected your family's wealth and reputation, and we make sure that no one else dies to keep those secrets buried." "Will I still be rich?" Evangeline asked, not with greed, but with the practical concern of a child who had grown up with privilege and was trying to understand what her future would look like. "You'll still be comfortable," Lady Catherine assured her. "The family's legitimate holdings will remain intact, but the wealth that was stolen from Seraphina's family will be returned to where it belongs." "Good," Evangeline said firmly. "Seraphina should have what's hers by right, and Mama should face consequences for trying to hurt people." London in the early morning was a city awakening to commerce and power, its streets filled with merchants, politicians, and the machinery of an empire that spanned the globe. Lady Catherine's townhouse in Belgravia provided a safe haven where they could plan their final assault on the Montclair family's fortress of lies. The legal documents were filed simultaneously in 3 different courts, ensuring that no single judge or magistrate could be influenced to suppress the case. The marriage certificate, love letters, and evidence of Edmund's murder were presented to the Times, the Guardian, and the Telegraph, guaranteeing that the story would reach every level of British society within hours. Most crucially, Evangeline herself provided testimony to a magistrate about the attempt on her life, corroborating the evidence of the family's willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets. The reaction was immediate and explosive. By noon, newsboys were shouting headlines about murder and fraud in one of England's most noble families. By evening, members of Parliament were calling for investigations into aristocratic corruption and abuse of power. By the next morning, warrants had been issued for the arrest of Duchess Isabelle Montclair and her co-conspirators. The Duchess, faced with irrefutable evidence and the testimony of her own daughter, chose exile over trial. She fled to France with what liquid assets she could gather, leaving behind the vast majority of the family's holdings to be distributed according to the court's judgment. The legal proceedings took months to fully resolve, but the outcome was never in doubt. Seraphina was acknowledged as the legitimate heir to Lord Edmund's personal estate, a fortune substantial enough to make her one of the wealthiest women in England. More importantly, the courts ruled that the marriage between Edmund and Celeste had been legal and binding, clearing the family name and establishing the truth that had been buried for 31 years. Epilogue. The garden restored 2 years after that rain-soaked morning, when a flower crown changed everything. Seraphina stood in the restored secret garden at Ravenshollow Castle, now her legal property. The fountain ran clear water again, the herb beds were properly tended, and the climbing roses had been trained back to their supporting walls. Evangeline, now 14, and preparing for university, knelt beside her planting new varieties of flowers they had discovered in botanical catalogues from around the world. The girl had recovered from her trauma with remarkable resilience, channeling her pain into a fierce dedication to justice and truth that promised to make her a formidable woman. "Do you ever regret it?" Evangeline asked, brushing soil from her hands. "Destroying everything we used to be?" Seraphina considered the question seriously. The legal battle had indeed destroyed the old order, not just for the Montclair family, but for aristocratic society as a whole. The case had established precedents that made it much harder for powerful families to cover up crimes or suppress inconvenient truths. "I regret the pain it caused you," she said finally. "I regret that your mother chose exile over facing the consequences of her actions. I regret that it took 31 years for justice to be served, but not the justice itself, never the justice itself," Seraphina said firmly. "Truth has its own power, little dove. When it finally emerges, it heals wounds that have been festering in darkness for far too long." She looked around the garden that had kept its secrets for so long, thinking about all the hands that had tended it, all the love that had been planted in its soil, all the hope that had bloomed despite decades of neglect. "Your great-uncle Edmund and my grandmother loved each other enough to risk everything," she continued. "They deserved to have that love honored and remembered, not buried and forgotten. Sometimes fighting for the truth is the only way to ensure that love triumphs over fear." Evangeline nodded solemnly, then smiled, the first completely carefree smile Seraphina had seen from her in months. "Then let's plant something beautiful," she said. "Something that will bloom for generations and remind people that love is always worth fighting for." As they worked together in the afternoon sunshine, their hands dark with rich earth, and their hearts light with the peace that comes from truth finally told. Seraphina hummed the ancient melody that had started it all, Chanson de la Rose Éternelle, no longer a dangerous secret, but a celebration of love that had indeed proved eternal. The song drifted over the restored garden, carrying with it the promise that some bonds truly cannot be broken by time, distance, or even death. And in the castle above them, the portraits of long-dead Montclairs seemed to look down with approval, finally able to rest knowing that their family's honor had been reclaimed, and their legacy restored to truth.